Okay, welcome everybody to the 2021 Virtual Budget Open House. I'm Councillor Tom Adams. I'm the chair of the Budget Committee, and I'm looking forward to taking some questions and having discussion with anybody who might be online who wants to call in. We do have a phone-in number for people to be able to call in and speak live with us. The number is 905-81. Bear with us as we deal with our feedback. Now we're good? I think so. Can you angle it in a different angle? Maybe we have figured out our technical issues. Sounds good at the moment, so hopefully we continue with this. I was about to give out the phone number for people to be able to call in this evening. The number is 905-815-6095, and we also have a budget email address that is budget@oakville.ca, and we are watching that email live, so if you prefer to email in a question or a comment, we would be happy to take that comment or question immediately from that email address. But like I said, we'd be happy to speak with people directly, 905-815-6095. We have an operator waiting for your call, and we'll link you into the council chamber here where we'll be able to have a conversation with you or take your comments, whichever that might be. We will put that phone number up on the screen in a few minutes. But in the meantime, if we don't have any immediate callers, I was going to go through a budget presentation to give our viewers a view of the Town of Oakville budget process and the 2021 budget plan that's coming forward and the recommendations from our staff that council will be considering in the upcoming weeks. So this is the presentation I'm going to go through. It's a few minutes long, but it will cover off both the process, the operating budget, the capital budget, a brief discussion of our town debt status, and the rates and fees that our various user groups pay as they use our facilities and our programs. The annual budget process in Oakville really is an annual long process. It begins almost immediately after a budget gets approved in December, and the hard discussion works start in June, where the budget committee is formed and gives direction to staff about the upcoming year. Through the summer months, our staff work behind the scenes preparing the department budgets, and that's looked at by our executive management team in the October-November timeframe before the budget is brought forward for public review and the budget committee's review starting in November. So that's where we are now. We're now looking through the public engagement process, and we've been having discussions with a number of groups about various elements of our budget, and this is part of that process. In December, we will be going through the budget committee recommendation process, where the committee will have deliberations, make a recommendation to council, and council will have the final approval in late December before the holiday season. These are the current dates that we've been working through. November 17th was the day on which the operating and capital budgets were presented. November 19th, we had some staff presentations to the committee. And December 1st and 3rd, we have formal public delegations before the budget committee. The December 15th date is the day when, as I said, the budget committee will be making recommendations to council, and council would be considering those for approval on December 21st. Our budget is planned and designed to match up with the council strategic plan, covering off important areas of focus of our council, including livability, engaging in the community, having an accountable government, working on our environment, and mobility issues. And it's important to understand the context in which we prepare our budget. The town of Oakville is only one part of your property tax bill. As you look at a property tax bill, you'll notice that the town of Oakville makes up about 41% of the bill. The region of Halton makes up another considerable chunk of 37%, and the education component makes up the rest. Together, that makes up the overall tax bill that a taxpayer pays, and council has consideration for the overall bill, as we know that that's what residents pay at the end of the day, and that's what a lot of people care about specifically. And so we set an overall property tax increase direction for our staff, and for many years now we've been setting the increase to be in line with inflation. And so recognizing the regional Halton component, which this year we expect now to be 1.8%, and the education component, which is expected to be 0% as it has been for a number of years, recognizing that the province has allowed municipalities the space to manage their property tax increases that way. It means that the town target was set at 2.31% earlier this summer. At the time, council looked at the inflation numbers and figured that 1.7% was a likely figure for the 2021 tax year. We recognize that inflation moves around a lot, and especially this year given COVID. We have been looking at inflation over the last couple of months. We recognize that inflation has dropped considerably over the summer months, but the Bank of Canada is using a 1 to 3% inflationary target with a 2% middle point of that, and hence whether we use 1.7% or some other figure close to it, we're generally in line with the expectations for long-range inflation. This is a slide that shows the overall property tax increases over a number of years. One thing changed in the late 2000s, and that was the introduction of performance-based budgeting, which is approximately when I started to chair the budget committee as well. But council moved to performance-based budgeting in part to ensure that we could consider not just the individual departments, but the outcomes that each group was intended to create for the community. Each of the years that we've been working on since that point, we've been targeting an overall property tax increase, as I described before. And by doing that, we've managed to do a number of good things for the community. First of all, we've had lower variability in our tax increases each year. You can look at the red line before the introduction of the performance-based budgeting. And you can see that it's very choppy in terms of the annual increases, high highs and low lows. And the green line shows how those numbers are much tighter and allows our businesses and our residents to plan better for the future in terms of tax increases. The increases themselves have actually been lower by almost a full percentage point annually during the years since PB2 was introduced. And we also have had a lower increase direction over time. So the trend has been down rather than up, as you see in the red area. So as I said, the overall property tax increase direction for our staff was a 1.7% increase. Since that time, the region of Halton has come in with a slightly lower figure from what we had expected. And so we are now looking at a recommendation of 1.62% overall. And that's in line with council's guideline. And we continue to use the PB2 methodology, maintaining the services that are valued by our residents and ensuring the town's strong financial position is maintained. We also have considerable funding for our infrastructure, maintaining it in a state of good repair. And of course, we are working very hard to accommodate the services that are required due to all of the growth, especially that in North Oakville. In terms of the overall size of the budget, you can see the gross investment in our services, both on the operating budget side as well as the capital budget side. And you can see in green at the bottom there, the net property tax levy for 2021 being $214.8 million. Of that tax dollar component, a large part of it goes to infrastructure renewal and emergency services being our fire department. Oakville Transit and the road network and the recreation and culture and parks and open space are other significant components of where your actual tax dollars go to. So in terms of the operating budget and how we put that together, We start with a base budget that looks similar to what we would have had last year in terms of the service levels that we had. We look at things like personnel increases, so that would be pay increases for our staff, and much of that is due to union contracts, so we have a lot of unionized staff. We also have economic conditions. I talked to you a little bit about inflation, and we ourselves have inflationary increases to things like fuels and utilities and other things that we buy to provide services to our residents. The impacts from capital and growth are another component that we consider. So for example, when we open a new community center to serve a new community, that community center would then have to be operated in the upcoming year. This year, we also have the impacts of COVID. And just like many households, the financial impact to municipalities has been tremendous, and that's one of the things I want to talk about briefly tonight as well. The operating budget started with, as I said, looking at the inflationary increases. We figured the increases this year due to inflation and other adjustments to our base budget were about $3 million. And that assumes no new services, but takes into account inflationary and volume adjustments to our user fees. Some of the big changes to our capital infrastructure included the new fire station number 8 in the Palermo area up in northwest Oakville. It also included the new Oakville Trafalgar Community Center, which will be operating a full year in 2021, as well as a host of new parks and trails, roads, trees, various systems and software components that have been added to our fleet of operations. The operating budget was severely impacted by revenue impacts from COVID. We figure that in the upcoming year, we'll have lost about $15.8 million in revenue, primarily in the areas of recreation and transit, with smaller components in parking and sport field rentals and a variety of other areas. We also have, of course, some other additional costs related to COVID. That includes enforcement staffing, janitorial services and supplies, and the total impact is about $17 million. We worked very hard to offset that loss in revenue and additional costs. We looked for a variety of one-time temporary mitigation measures, and through a great deal of work behind the scenes, there's about $10 million in one-time temporary mitigation that has been put together. Council already agreed to waive what we call the 1% capital levy this upcoming year. The 1% capital levy is funding that is used to renew the infrastructure of the town. And for years, going back to 1996, the town has added an extra 1% to property taxes in Oakville in order to provide funding for renewal of infrastructure. We have gotten to a point where our capital levy is providing very, very strong funding for our renewal needs. And council was at the point where we were considering whether it was necessary to maintain the capital levy at the level it was. And I would say that the waiving of the 1% capital levy is an appropriate measure under the circumstances. I think had you asked me last year, I would have said that we could reduce it but not remove it. And so I think that we will likely have to bring the capital levy back in future years, but perhaps not to the level that it was previously. So there's a number of other measures we took that includes gapping of vacant positions, savings from various fees that we would pay for instructors or performers, savings in fuels and contracted services. There's of course a number of offset reductions to some of our things like office supplies and mileage and so forth. The town was also undergoing a number of service reviews. These are reviews that we were undertaking to find efficiencies in our operations. They were done not because of COVID, but they happened to align with the timing that COVID happened. And so there's about $1 million in savings from these various efficiency reviews. So that brings me to the impact to the various departments from these changes. You can see that there's a very significant impact to Oakville Transit and the recreation and culture area, and those are because of those changes in our revenue. The corporate revenue and expense side is on the negative side, which means that there's approximately $3.4 million in tax stabilization funding that we are going to use in the upcoming year to offset some of the remaining costs from COVID. This is a one-time measure that we believe we will be able to reverse in a future year when some of these revenues return to a more normal level. So in terms of the operating budget, we do have a number of different sources of expenses, but a primary expense is our personnel costs, and that's similar to most municipalities where about half the costs are related to the staff that we have on hand providing services to our community. The other big component you'll see in the green component of this chart is the transfers to capital, and that's a large part of that is related to the capital levy that we use to renew our infrastructure. This slide is showing the source of our revenue to fund our operating budget. A big blue part of this pie chart is the taxation component, so that's property taxes, which is 62% of our total. In previous years, that number was actually a little bit smaller, and the drop in revenue from our various programs that we would normally receive is pushing up this taxation number. It used to be, as I said, under 60%, this year rising up to 62%. The opposite side of this chart is the fees and charges, which makes up this year 19% of our revenue for financing our operations. That number would have been larger in previous years, and so when we choose to reduce our fees or we have asks for reducing fees on various programs, the impact of those reductions is a higher level of taxation that's required to subsidize those programs. And I just wanted to show, this chart is a very busy chart or table, but it shows the various reserves that the town of Oakville has. Many of these reserves are specific to various areas, and the funds have to be used for the area for which they're designated. The bottom one is the Stabilization Reserve, and its starting projection is for the upcoming year would be $66 million, and through the use of some of those reserves in the upcoming year, we think that we'll be able to, manage the overall tax bill better, but we believe that we can do this in a good and stable way for the community in as much as those reserves are significant. And it's unlike a number of our neighboring communities and other municipalities where the stabilization reserves really aren't quite as strong as they are in Oakville. There's a recommended target of 17% of what's called own source revenue, which is considered best practice in terms of the stabilization reserves. And you'll see on the right-hand side of this chart that the town of Oakville stabilization reserves are significantly more than 17%, which allows us to, in bad situations like the COVID pandemic, to draw upon those stabilization reserves and maintain services that are important for the community at this time. And despite the intended draw upon the stabilization reserves, our level of reserves will be maintained significantly more than 17%. So looking at the town of Oakville component of the tax bill, the base budget increase is looking like about 1.95%. The impacts due to COVID are significantly higher at 3.32%. We will be drawing upon the tax stabilization reserves, which provides a reduction of 1.66. We also have growth in the town, and so one common question that comes up is, well, we have all this growth in the town, doesn't that mean that we don't have to pay new taxes? Those new homes and businesses that come into town, they come online and they begin to pay new taxes, and the year in which they bring in that new assessment allows us to have a one-time reduction in our taxes, but the years thereafter, those communities are looking for the same services that our existing communities have, and so you're not really any better off in the long run. When you add all those four components together, you get the town's total increase of 2.31%, which, as I said, when you blend it with the education and the regional component, you get to the 1.62% overall increase that we are looking at for 2021 for our residents. Now, The town of Oakville, the one thing I wanted to say is the town of Oakville Council obviously controls its own budget here. The region of Halton budget is controlled by the regional council, and half of the members of the town council are actually regional council members as well, like myself. And so by having control of not only the town budget, but having strong influence over the regional budget, it allows us to manage the overall bill for our residents. And looking forward to future years, 2022 and 2023, we look like we're going to be in a fairly good position to be able to maintain our overall tax increases in line with inflation. That's the forward-looking forecast we have at this time. And of course, we're going to have to be looking at reversing those one-time mitigation reductions that we have this year. We are looking forward to being able to have some of those revenues resume. And we will, of course, have operating impacts from a wide variety of new capital projects that are coming up. And those are the numbers looking forward, looking at an overall bill of 1.7% and 2% for 2022 and 2023. So a couple comments about our capital budget. Capital budget is the budget that we use to fund projects that will build something that will last for a number of years for our community. That would include things like roads, it would include large vehicles like transit vehicles, buildings like our community centers. Those are all things that would be funded through our capital budget. The funding envelope for the upcoming year will be impacted by the deferral of the capital levy that I spoke about earlier. And so a number of projects will have to be moved outwards in terms of the year in which they occur. This past year, in 2020, as a result of the COVID pandemic, there were about $70 million in capital projects that were deferred for the following years. And so those projects that were deferred this year became the starting point of our capital budget preparations for next year. We also looked at what projects and what infrastructure were critical and needed to be done immediately for health and safety reasons or other reasons. And of course, we have to have careful consideration for our staff's capacity to deliver on some of these high-profile projects. So the size of our budget, our capital budget next year is $81 million. You can see that some of the big parts of it are the infrastructure planning and stormwater area. So that's roads and stormwater systems. We also have significant funding in our Oakville Transit budget for new electric buses. This is the capital budget by category. Infrastructure renewal makes up almost 60% or 58% of our capital budget next year, followed by the growth area at 24%. The growth area is the funding that we use for funding projects to support growth in the community. So if you think about North Oakville, for example, a lot of the projects there fall into that category. Some of the highlighted capital budget items include the greening of our fleet. So those are electric buses for Oakville Transit. There's also significant funding for stormwater and erosion control, $9.5 million worth of projects. We have $6.8 million in active transportation projects covering things like cycle lanes, multi-use trails, and sidewalks. Significant funding for new neighborhood parks and trails, and a number of the other items that you see here. Our capital funding comes significantly from the capital levy that I've spoken about a fair bit. We also receive development charges. So when a new house or a new business is built, a new commercial building is built, the town of Oakville and the region of Halton receive development charges. Those development charges are there to help build the roads and other services that then serve those new communities. Finally, we often get asked about the debt level in the community for the town of Oakville. The town of Oakville has a very low debt level. Most of the debt that we have is actually not tax supported. It's supported through other means. You'll see the $105 million outstanding debt at the end of 2020, moving down to $99 million at the end of 2021. A big chunk of that is hospital debt. So when the new Oakville Hospital was built, the town of Oakville provided $90 million in funding towards it. And that funding is being borne by Oakville Hydro and a number of non-distribution assets that the Oakville Enterprise Corporation has. And so that's funding that doesn't come out of your property taxes. We also have a number of self-supported projects that are debt-supported. Harbors includes things like dredging. The development charges cover some other projects, including the 16-mile sports complex. And the Oakville Soccer Club is through a leasing program covering the cost of the Pine Glen Soccer Building. Of the top component there, that's called under the tax levy supported debt, the $13.8 million that you'll see at the end of 2021. The LED streetlight conversion project is actually funded through efficiencies and savings from the conversion project itself. So it's basically a self-funded project, leaving the remaining little over $5 million being truly tax levy supported. So the amount of debt that the town of Oakville has that's supported by property taxes is really very minimal. Finally, a comment on rates and fees. One of the things that sometimes comes up from users is wondering what's going to happen in terms of the fees they pay. It's been posted on the town website. It's about a 120-page document, if I recall by memory. And you'll see that most of those increases are in line with inflation at about 1.7%. And so that is, of course, something that is of concern to some of our user groups. However, Council did already give direction that those increases be tied to inflation for 2021. So next steps, this is a slide that I pulled out from another presentation. It's happening on November 25th, not earlier, but in terms of next steps, as I just said earlier, we will be taking formal public delegations by the Budget Committee on December 1st and 3rd, and on December 15th, the Budget Committee will have deliberations and make a recommendation to Council for Council's consideration on the 21st of December. So I look forward to people getting involved and providing comments. As I said earlier, we have a budget email address, budget@oakville.ca, and we would be happy to take emails right away. But if you have comments later, we'll be looking at that email address over the next couple of weeks to provide information to the Budget Committee and Council. The Budget House is this evening, obviously. We have 2 delegation days and times, one in the morning, December 1st, and one in the evening, December 3rd, for people to provide formal comment to Committee and Council. So I look forward to questions, and I'm going to look to our staff to see whether we've got any comments through either of our 2 sources here. And all right, we do have operators waiting. 905-815-6095. You see that call-in number there on your screen. And I do look forward to having a conversation with anybody who does call in. A few of the comments that we have had earlier included some questions about, first of all, could we use our tax stabilization reserves to go to zero, so to speak, in terms of our property tax increase? One question that was that highlighted this issue. And looking back at the slide that I showed earlier about the reserve levels that the town of Oakville has, like I said, we do have significant reserves. However, the reserves really need to be used for one-time funding. And if you look at this slide, you'll see that our base budget is in fact increasing as a result of contract increases for salaries and wages and a number of other things. And if we did use tax stabilization funding to offset that component, we would find that in a future year we would need to increase property taxes to make up for that use of the tax stabilization reserves, which would mean that we would have a very rocky year in a future year in order to make up for that lost revenue from that one-time use. And so if I bring us back to the discussion that we had about the annual increases over time, the use of stabilization reserves in to pay for base increases or inflationary increases to our operations would mean that the green line would have to take a sudden dip down if you'd use them for a single year, but then you'd have a sudden increase that would be significantly more than inflation in a future year to make up for it. and you would return to where we were previously in the red line with the spiky nature of our increases. So that was one issue or one question that came up earlier. We did have questions about whether rates could be dropped for our user groups significantly more than they are currently. And again, we have an issue there in terms of the subsidization from our property taxes. So if we dropped the rates significantly, we would have to increase taxes to make up for it. There's a number of groups that I know are out in the community that are nonprofit groups, that are sports groups, and they do have concerns over whether they'll be able to survive through the pandemic. And of course, we're working with them and watching to make sure that we are good team players in terms of providing the services our community needs from those various organizations. And the council has had a long history of working with groups as they deal with unexpected issues. Going to check in again. I'm getting a head shake with no activity happening on our line. Oh, yes. I understand that there's a number of interested parties in active transportation, and we have this year worked to try to show where our capital dollars are going in active transportation. And we do have a wide variety of new projects in that area, and council, recognizing the impact of COVID, is working to increase the funding in that sector. I had in the capital budget a total figure of active transportation funding. That was the 6.8%. But it includes projects that are not only separated cycle lanes or multi-use trails, but we also have a number of road reconstruction projects that also include active transportation components. And so if you turn to the capital budget, which is online, the capital budget itself there's 229 pages of projects listed in our capital budget, so it's a lengthy document. But it does include a summary component which shows the various construction projects in our infrastructure area, where you'll see things like the Wycroft Road widening and AT, which is the active transportation. And so some of these large road projects also incorporate changes to the right-of-way that would incorporate better active transportation. And so I would urge you to take a look at some of those projects as well. We are also looking for grant funding opportunities from the federal government and provincial government, for that matter, which will help us fund some of these projects. We have received in the past funding to help a number of our projects move forward, for example, the Crosstown Trail. We had a question about the greening of Oakville's fleet, and so I wanted to highlight again the top line on this capital budget, the $14.4 million in green fleet infrastructure. The town of Oakville is receiving through the federal government significant funding to provide electric buses over the upcoming years. So all of our buses going forward, as we do replacement or acquire new buses, will be electric buses now. There's significant electric vehicle charging infrastructure that has to go along with that greening of the electric bus fleet. And so you'll see a significant number of buses in 2021. I believe it's 10 new buses overall between the renewal of our fleet and new vehicles. We also have some smaller vehicles that will be electric or hybrid vehicles as well. So depending on the nature of the vehicle within our broad range of vehicles, you'll start to see significant numbers of them being electric. The greening of the Oakville transit fleet is if you look through the budget capital document, you'll see that particular line item is a very significant line item over a number of years, and that reflects the funding allotment that we're receiving through the federal government. There's another question that's come up, which is the Emerald Ash Borer and our funding for that. You'll see here there's $3.2 million in the town's tree canopy and natural environment. Part of that is in response to the Emerald Ash Borer. So over a number of years now, the town has been doing two things. First of all, we've been treating a large number of trees with trees in to try to maintain ash trees that are viable to be kept. Largely those would be trees that you'd see either as street trees or large significant park trees. And then there's a large number of trees that have to be removed because sadly they haven't survived the ash borer. Those are trees, for example, that are along trails through our forest networks and so forth. Those trees have to be cut down, removed in a safe way, and there's been, over the years, millions of dollars spent by the town of Oakville on emerald ash borer, either treatments or removal and replacements. The Region of Halton also has a significant emerald ash borer fund, and various other organizations that we work with, such as the conservation areas, they also have funding related to emerald ash borer. I'm going to cover off a common question that council members receive all the time, and that is, what are you doing to deal with the traffic on my street? We've got significant funding this year in traffic calming infrastructure. That includes the first set of funding that's moving forward for automated speed enforcement, or commonly known as photo radar, in which next year we would be preparing the contracts and tendering for that technology in order to be able to implement it the year after in 2022. The Budget Committee did receive a report and is making recommendations to Council to proceed with significant additional funding on our traffic calming process, as well as reducing the thresholds to look at streets for implementing various kinds of traffic calming. For those who aren't familiar with our traffic calming process, we do look at measures on the street. So we do traffic surveys on a street, and when the what's called the 85th percentile of speeding is 10 kilometers or more than the speed limit, we would start to look at introducing some kind of traffic calming. The recommendation from the Budget Committee to Council was to reduce that threshold from 10 kilometers over the limit to 5 kilometers over the limit, and to provide additional funding in order to address what we think will be a larger number of streets that require some kind of attention. There will also be some process changes to the way in which we address streets where there are complaints. So that's another common question that does come up. Another question that's come up is digital infrastructure funding, and what is the town doing to bring ourselves into the 21st century of business. We've got a number of things that are ongoing. We don't incorporate all of our digital work into a single line item. All of our various business areas are in various levels of going online, I'll call it, and so it's part of doing business, just as it is in the private sector. We have everything from our library units to our recreation units providing online services now. We are also bringing in significant changes in terms of our ability to provide planning and building services in an online format. So taking in applications and responding to applications online is a big part of what we're doing. We also have refreshes to our online presence through our website and so forth that are upcoming. And so you'll see the bottom line there is responding to the question of what kind of funding is there for implementing online and digital solutions. But that funding, in terms of the capital budget, is spread out across the various business units that we have. Okay, I just wanted to remind people of our call-in phone number, 905-815-6095, and the budget email, budget@oakville.ca. We, of course, are watching those two sources of new questions so that we can respond to them as they come in. There's a common question that's come up, and that is, what are we using in our budget for diesel for our transit vehicles? The answer is 92 cents a liter is what we're using in our budget. Somebody wanted to know the answer to what kind of KPIs or key performance indicators are we using. One good way of finding the answer to that is if you go to oakville.ca, you'll be able to see our dashboard. And so I would urge you to use our search tool and pull up dashboard in the results. You'll see a variety of different areas that we watch regularly. So these are performance indicators that are watched by, obviously by council, but also by our senior management team in terms of things that are important to the community as indicators of how well we're doing. So they do cover a wide variety of things, including things like environmental leadership, so greenhouse gas, energy consumption, so a wide variety of indicators that are used. You'll also see a lot of those kind of indicators within the budget book itself. Each of the various tabs or departments or groups that we have indicators that are a component of our budget. Interesting question that's come up, which is our infrastructure asset management process and whether we're using debt to cover off our renewal needs. The answer is no. The capital infrastructure that we need to renew is largely being funded through our capital levy. And so we have a very strong renewal effort for our infrastructure, including our road network. A couple of years ago, the council did put in place a hot mix funding levy. That was a special levy that went to funding the renewal of our local roads. We removed that a few years ago, and we now believe that we're in a pretty good place in terms of our road network and the quality of our roads. We are now starting to provide additional funding for our stormwater management programs. And so a lot of that funding is being redirected now into that renewal need of our storm network, our stormwater network. So I'm going to take us over to our capital slide. And I can show you the funding source that we've got. So that's our capital levy on the blue side, where we've got $35.6 million. That capital levy is tax dollars that are being used to do the renewal on a pay-as-you-go kind of way. It allows us to do the road network renewal, the repaving of your local streets, the renewal of our community centers, the renewal of our stormwater systems, for example, a wide variety of things that need to be renewed over time, just as you need to renew the roof on your house, without the need for bringing on debt to do that. There are a lot of other communities that are required to use debt because they don't have a capital levy that's strong enough to do that. And the problem with that is it then ties their hands in future years in terms of their ability to take advantage of opportunities that might come up, or to be able to respond to significant emergency issues. For example, the COVID-19 emergency that we're dealing with now. So it allows for a great deal of flexibility in terms of responding to what might come forward. That's a good question that's come up. And the question is, do the development charges fully pay for growth? There's been some change to the way development charges will be funded. There used to be a 10%, what I called the 10% haircut on a lot of our soft services, where for things like libraries and rec centers, 90% of it might be covered by development charges from new homes. But the remaining 10% to serve those new communities had to be paid for by existing taxpayers. The province has helpfully changed that rule, and that's removing that 10% haircut. And so we look forward to future years when the development charges from those new communities will more or less offset the new costs that they bring to the town in terms of the need to provide capital infrastructure for those new communities. So that is a little bit of a good news story for municipalities that are in heavy growth areas like Oakville. I'm going to read out that phone number again, 905-815-6095. We would be very happy to connect with you. We haven't had any call-ins yet, but a number of good questions that we've been able to respond to. There's a question that's come up, and that is, what about the new community centers and new services for North Oakville? When will they get a community center and so forth? One thing that the budget does incorporate is funding for the design of the North Park area, and that would allow us to then, in a future year, bring forward funding to actually do some of the construction and building. Just give me a minute to get the exact number. There it is. So we have $500,000 in the capital budget for the funding of the design work. And that's an important thing for a lot of residents in North Oakville, in those new communities, to be looking forward to what that'll look like. And so there'll be an opportunity in 2021 to engage in that discussion and to have some influence on what that design will look like and what will actually get built when the funding gets put in to the capital budget in one of the years after 2021. Okay, so questions come in. Is this going to be available in the future? Is this presentation going to be available for people to refer back to? The answer is yes. It'll be put online along with the other budget YouTube videos, and so it'll be available for others to look at their will. Again, the phone number is 905-815-6095, and the email is budget@oakville.ca. We are just about 7:52 or 7:53 here. We were planning to go till 8 o'clock. So if you do have your questions, we urge you to get them in so that we can answer them. If you come up with your questions later, we look forward to answering them at a later date. You can email them at any time to budget@oakville.ca, and we will be monitoring that email address to be able to provide your comments to the Budget Committee or to respond to any questions or engage with you directly if you want to speak with us. I would be happy to speak with anybody or any groups that have a concern or a question about the budget process or the budget that's being put forward for consideration of council. I'm available at any time to take a call or answer an email. There's a question that's come in, which is, I know that a number of council members have had this question, which is come to them from residents, which is, when will a loose leaf collection come to their neighborhood? There's been a number of neighborhoods who have just realized that they're not getting loose leaf collection happen, but they're bagging their leaves as they always have. And they realize that some other parts of Oakville do receive loose leaf collection. The town of Oakville Council has been using approximately a 25-year threshold in terms of the age of a neighborhood before they extend loose leaf collection to a new area. The information in terms of what the services are right now is available on oakville.ca. We have a number of older parts of the community that have multiple collections, and we have some extension areas or new service areas that receive a single collection in the fall. Council has been asked to consider what areas need to be considered by our staff in terms of service adjustments. And so I know that there have been council members who have provided comment to our staff to consider different streets or different areas, including those that are at the 25-year mark and other areas that might be adjacent to natural areas and while they might not have large trees on their own property, they might be adjacent to large trees that are just off their property and receive the leaf fall from them. And so staff are going to be considering that and bringing back a report to the committee for consideration later this December. One question that has come up in the past has been one about growth management and how we respond to that. The town does have in the capital budget a number of planning studies. Like I did say earlier, there's a number of growth projects in our capital project list that respond to the new communities. And funding generally from that pot of money goes to areas where there is development happening. And so as new development comes on, our capital budgets from year to year respond to that by adjusting where new projects are going. So if we do see a particular subdivision that's growing or a new high density development going into a particular area, for example, a new park would be funded in that area as opposed to another area where perhaps the development hadn't proceeded yet. And so we do adjust our programs to match when and where development is happening. Council has in the past had to choose to remove growth-related funding projects when, for example, project development wasn't happening at the rate it had been previously expected. And so we adjust our growth capital budget accordingly. We also adjust our operating budget accordingly as well. I did show in one of the slides assessment growth as one of the factors that helps to reduce our operating budget costs. There it is here. So you'll see that line that's called less assessment growth. And so when a new house gets built, the assessment related to that new home helps to offset the new operating costs associated with providing services to that home. Broadly speaking, the two match up, and we do look at trying to hold off the use of assessment growth in our budget and bring it in the year in which the new capital projects are built and then have to be operated. And that helps to reduce the variability in our operating budget and the tax impact on our residents year by year. Okay, we have reached 8 o'clock. We do not have any phone calls in, but the number was 905-815-6095. So I'll do a final call, and if something comes in the next moment or two, then great. But I'm going to wrap up our session this evening. The email address that we've been using is budget@oakville.ca. And if you do have in the future some questions or some feedback for the committee, we look forward to seeing it at that email address. This, as I said earlier, this presentation will be available online for future viewers, and I look forward to hearing back from anybody who's got some comments. So thank you very much, everyone who's been watching, and for the questions that we've received both tonight as well as at other times through the process. The consultations that we've been doing have been very useful, and I can tell you that our committee and our council is listening intently to the comments and questions that we have received and do receive in the future. So thank you again very much. Thank you to our staff who've helped set this up this evening. I appreciate all the efforts that you've done to make this a success tonight.